Muchas gracias, Josefina. Oye, por motivos de la participación de Rhett Morris, a quien vamos a presentar en pocos segundos más, vamos a hacer este panel en inglés. Así que entiendo, Josefina, confírmamelo tú que hay traducción simultánea, ¿no?
Así me comentaron a mí también por interno, me lo dijeron.
Perfecto. Oye, bueno, entonces vamos a cambiar a inglés, haciendo nuestro mejor esfuerzo y presentar este panel. Welcome to our Public Policy and Startup to Scale Up panel. This morning we will discuss how governments and states can help to improve entrepreneurial ecosystems along our economy with a group of outstanding leaders in the area. We have three business leaders joining us this morning. We'll start with Marisol Alarcón. She's on the left hand of the panel. She's the founder of Laboratoria. Laboratoria is an organization that encourages people to develop their skills in the digital age. They work in Chile, Brazil, Peru, Colombia, and Mexico, and their role has been highlighted by President Obama at one point in time, and Mark Zuckerberg. That's what I read. And they work with allies as Google and IBM. So Marisol is going to give her perspective about how to improve ecosystems. Good morning, Marisol.
Good morning. Nice to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Okay. Then we have joining us Mariano Mayer, who's the founder of and CEO of Marea Venture Partners, and former Secretary of Entrepreneurship and SMEs, that's Pymes in Spanish, in Argentina. He worked with Mauricio Macri government at the city and national level, designing public policy for startup and SMEs. Good morning, Mariano.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation and for letting me participate in this amazing panel.
Perfect. And then on the right, we have Rhett Morris. He's a partner of Common Good Labs that uses data science to improve people's life, applying technology to improve life and maximize social impact. Is that right, Rhett?
That sounds right to me. Thank you very much. Excited to be here.
Perfect. He was also for 10 years the leader of Endeavor Insight, the research area of Endeavor Global in New York City. Great to have you here, Rhett. Thank you very much. So we'll start with the first question. We have three main questions for you guys to develop for all of you. You all work as ecosystem builders from different perspectives. Laboratoria seeks to increase the number of women in tech. Mariano has led Argentina's startup policies, and Rhett has worked in data science and research. The first question is in your opinion and in your experience, what are the key drivers and aspects for developing a solid and vibrant scale-up ecosystem and startup ecosystem, and the role of the different stakeholders in it? We're talking about government, investors, universities, and obviously entrepreneurs. What if we start with Marisol?
Sure, Gonzalo. Well, I would say that given the experience I've lived and what I've seen of many other entrepreneurs, I think that one of the first main aspects of this is the real decision to push this forward, this ecosystem forward, right? And that's when you need a strong public and private sector really endorsing this with real budgets, resources, and teams to make this happen, right? Because many times you hear governments or countries saying they want to push this forward, but at the end of the day, the budgets are not allocated to this, right? And I think that that is something key, and that we have seen in Chile specifically work really well with Corfo, Startup Chile, that is very renowned around the world. Regarding the private sector, obviously, I think we still need to grow that sector regarding specifically investors, but it is also clearly growing in the past years, and the interest of sectors in the different type of entrepreneurs that are growing in Chile has been clear. And I think that with the strong push from the public and private sectors, entrepreneurs also get engaged and want to be part of this because they know that there's background for this, right? I would also say that in once you have that settled, I think that you need to make sure that the initiatives that are being pushed ensure everyone's participation, right? That means that programs are strictly focused on all the cities around the country. Those of you who know Chile, we're very centralized, but that's why it's key to have programs that are focused on all the cities, focused also on different, on women, for example. And in that case, I think the S Factor program from Startup Chile has been crucial in identifying and motivating women as tech entrepreneurs, right? And also, of course, with programs that focus on different races, people with different capabilities. I think that's key, right? Because if you don't focus the processes on them, it's hard for them to really apply and to see themselves as part of it, right? I would also say that it's key to have simple processes. Well, I've applied to many funds. I've pitched probably every single opportunity that there was out there, and I got to see how many of my colleagues struggled throughout the different bureaucracies sometimes to be able to access to these opportunities, and that also at the end of the day narrowed down the scope of the people that could apply to these programs, right? Because it was hard to understand. People had never written this kind of proposals before, and I think there should be a strong effort to make sure that we make this sector open and welcoming for everyone, right? I think those are the key aspects I would say, and obviously including the academy here, universities, all type of institutions teaching and talking about entrepreneurship and how this can be a path for all the young people, I think is also key. And I've also seen it grown across the years, and I have participated accompanying many of these programs in different universities, and I've seen how it's grown too, right? And I think it's key in order for us to be able to have this ecosystem stronger as we speak.
Okay. Mariano, in your experience, you led the Ministry on Public Policies in Argentina, which has been very successful. We need to say that in developing scale-ups and very successful companies. What do you think about this problem?
Well, I think it's very important what Marisol mentioned, but even with the decision and the money to do programs and public policies to foster entrepreneurship, it's very important to understand the role of the public sector and the private sector. I mean, you have always the temptation of the government being the main character of this, and you are just one part of the ecosystem. So you need to fully understand where, for example, the public sector adds value and where it doesn't, and that's very important. When we started, the first book I read as a policymaker was Boulevard of Broken Dreams from Josh Lerner, a professor from Harvard, about this, and he explains a lot of policies in the world which were not successful because the government didn't understand the role and where it can help and where it makes trouble because it distorts the market. So and that there's not a recipe, a general recipe for any country, not even for any city. So you have to understand in your ecosystem, a country, a state, a city, where the ecosystem is underdeveloped or where you need to foster, if it's regulation, if it's bureaucracy, if it's talent, if it's finance and co-finance. So that's the first question every policymaker should ask before doing anything. That's one thing. The other is to try to institutionalize that, and that's where the public-private team and articulation is so important, because governments change. If you want to have policies that can endure and then can have an impact, it needs time, because when you're talking about ecosystems, you are in a way talking about biology, and it has time to develop. So you need to institutionalize the policies, and that's the private sector is very important in the co-creation of the policies and the sustainability of the policies, because if not, every time the government changes, then everything it goes back to zero again. And the third aspect, which Marisol mentioned, is something, is you have to, even inside the public sector, you have to understand the different levels and where this is something that could be done by the federal government or the national government, and where it's most important to develop local capabilities at the city level, at the states level, and where you add value and where you need to work together with the local governments to have it to be more sustainable, these kind of policies. And the final thing, it's also the private sector should understand its role, because if you want sustainability, then you have to stood up and you have to be involved and not just let the policies be alone, because sometimes it could be important for you to defend those policies, first thing. And the other is don't ask everything to the government. That's a typical problem in Latin America, because it creates a vicious circle where the governments, it has money and they give money, a lot of money to startups, and you distort the market. And so it's important that the money from the government should be precise and where it can help, and not create this circle of grantpreneurs, as we policymakers call. And that it's also some part of responsibility of the entrepreneurs to ask the government where it can help and create this virtuous circle between the private sector and the public sector.
Okay, we'll elaborate about those issues later, because they're very interesting. Rhett, what's your perspective after 10 years in Endeavor Research and now in your company? How do you see this problem evolving?
So I would echo the comments made by our two other panelists. I think I maybe would just add a few things. So one of the things I think that Endeavor has consistently shown with research, and Endeavor in Chile recently had a piece of analysis that was released that showed this as well, specifically for Chile, is when we're thinking about ecosystems, one of the things that's very important to keep in mind is that scale-ups are uniquely important. So scale-ups, which are companies that are growing at very fast rates, companies that have kind of are at more of a growth stage than maybe an initial startup stage. In Chile, over the last 3 years, represent only about 1% of all companies. Yet those 1% of all companies created about 40% of all new jobs. So that 1% of companies are very, very important. Yes. And so as we're thinking about policy, whether it's the role of government or whether it's the role of the private sector or other institutions like universities or investors, one of the things I think we have to keep central is, what are our goals? And if our goals are to create jobs and to create economic growth, we need to make sure that scale-ups are a part of the program. Because even though they're very small in number, they have a very big impact. But because they're very small in number, sometimes they are overlooked. The second thing I would emphasize is because ecosystems for entrepreneurship are complex systems, and because they're communities, it really does take engagement across a number of people working together. And that means dialogue and continual conversation between all the actors, because the way the ecosystem is today is not what it's going to be in 6 months. It's not what it's going to be in a year. And so there needs to be constant engagement on all parties. And the last thing I think that stands out to me is that when we think about entrepreneurship, entrepreneurs are a unique group of people because they're building companies. And when governments are trying to serve entrepreneurs, it's not the same thing as when governments are trying to serve and support programs for people who maybe are poor, who don't have the ability to support kind of the programs that they're benefiting from. I think ultimately government can play a great role as a catalyzer, And government can play a great role of helping to make sure that entrepreneurship communities are very inclusive and that everyone can have opportunities. But if a program is designed for entrepreneurs, it needs to, in most cases, become self-sustaining so that we don't have grantpreneurs coming in and just living off of programs over and over again. Because if entrepreneurs are benefiting from a program, that means their companies are growing. And if their companies are growing, that means they have some funding and they need to be contributing to support the ongoing efforts of the programs as a sign that this is valuable to them, I think.
Okay, I'm building up on that role that Rhett mentions. There's always the temptation of government choosing the winners in different industries, compared to some other view that says, well, I'll develop a stable environment where companies can develop. I guess that's the U.S. way, I would call it. What do you think between these two schools of thought? One more Latin American, people saying, okay, we'll encourage this type of industry compared to the other one. What are your thoughts on that balance of views of the role of the government? Marisol.
I say that it's essential, right, for the government to take the clear stake there and to have a clear vision of what it wants to push forward, right, and how that ecosystem really relates to the development of the country that they want to have. And I agree, the temptation there is to focus on those projects that are renowned and those people that are also known, that have been there in the ecosystem before. But I definitely think the effort of going beyond that is completely necessary, and specifically in times like the one we're living today, right, where I think that innovation is key, and it's proving to be one of the key factors for us to come out of the crisis we're living. And we can't have the narrow mind as to say that only a specific group of people with a specific type of education, with a specific type of intervention in this ecosystem are the ones that are going to have the best solutions, right? I think it's essential for the government to take a role on identifying those more invisible actors that are out there, with a real alignment on how we can help those people move forward their enterprises, and in that sense move forward the economy and the development of the country that the government wants to push forward, right? I think there definitely has to be a connection between how the different governments, and hopefully the state, not only the governments, right, the view of the development of the country is looking forward, and how the ecosystem is going to play an important role on that development, right? And I think that is a real challenge, right? How do we make sure that these are not government projects or government ideas, but a statewide vision of how we see our countries in 20, 50 years, right? And I think that is an important challenge, given the type of governments we have. Perhaps 4 years might not be enough to manage that, given the specific interests the governments have. But I think we need a stronger vision between that connection, right? Where do we see ourselves in 20, 30 years, and how does this ecosystem that we want to push forward will be a key role? And I think the crisis we're living now is a key example that shows that people have the capacity to innovate, to create new programs, and we as the public or private sector with the resources and the vision must be in support of all these ideas, right?
Okay, Mariano, you had to make decisions on this issue while you were managing this problem, no? How do you see this?
Well, big discussions there. Of course, I would prefer, or I prefer plan A, or first thing, to level the field. I mean, there's so much to do in the competitiveness landscape, especially in Latin America, and especially when you're talking about scale-ups, because in some of our countries, because of the regulation, because of taxes, bureaucracy growing, I mean, scaling up is a problem. Because
that's a major problem. Those are the major
problems. So, or at least growing in a formal way, That's why there's so much informality. And that's a tragedy for a country, that growing is a problem. So there's a lot of things to do in that way, in bureaucracy and regulation, taxes, etc. Then I would prefer, and I always said that the private sector has a better eye to pick winners or to pick sectors than the government. That was our approach. Of course, there are certain things that the government could do to foster more than a sector, or to test at least some things in, I don't know, basic research, infrastructure for basic research. For example, what Israel did with cars. Israel did a bet on electric vehicles and software for that, and now it's a big industry in Israel. But one thing is to decide or choose a sector, which is a big discussion. But then it's how to do that, because what we did was applying not only the American system of tax incentives for investment, but also the co-investment or the matching funds. So if you can leverage part of the investment of the private sector, then that's a way of not choosing winners, but supporting the ones who have the expertise and the eyes to choose winners. For example, doing a matching funds program with VCs or investors. That's one way of supporting, in a way, the development of the avant-garde sectors or the most innovative ones. And I think that that's also a big public discussion if government should enter in investment with matching funds or giving money to startups, especially in Latin America, because the discussion with the public opinion, if you are giving money to rich people, for example, typical discussion. I think that there's so much need to explain, because for me, venture capital is one of the most democratizing tools that you can have. Because venture capital seeks to provide financing for anyone who is talent anywhere in the country, and it doesn't matter if you went to that school or if you are a friend of that. It's just looking for talent, and talent is everywhere. So it's a very powerful tool, venture capital, and I think that governments could have a role, at least at the beginning, to support the development of that, but not choosing companies, but choosing the investors that have the eye to choose the companies.
Okay. Rhett, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I would echo everything that Mariano said. As usual, I'm almost always in agreement with Mariano. But
you didn't know that.
It's tough to. He's a tough act to follow. I think one of the things that's important to realize is when we talk about the kind of American way of doing things, if we look historically, the United States, if you look at the development of the technology industry, the United States did a lot of things that maybe don't necessarily fit people's idea of the American model. So much of the kind of basic research that supports many technology companies in the United States, even going all the way back to computer chips in Silicon Valley, when they were, what was called Silicon Valley because they were making silicon computer chips, that the research on those initial silicon transistors was taken by the United States from a private company, licensed and turned into an open source product that any entrepreneur could build on. And so that's an example of a government making an intervention, supporting basic research that they had funded in other ways before, and then saying, hey, we're going to turn something into open source so that it can be leveraged by many entrepreneurs. Even if we think about the development of the venture capital industry in the United States, what Mariano is describing, the idea of matching funding for individual kind of qualified investors, is something that the United States government did for a very long time before the venture capital industry became mature. And so I think that it's important to recognize that the best formula depends on where a country might be at any given point in time and what the overall international context is. I think if you listen to entrepreneurs themselves, what they would tell you that they would hope for from government would, one, the first thing would be fairness, but also consistency. If everyone experiences the same rules, but they're changing all the time, that's fair, but it's still a very difficult environment for entrepreneurs to operate in. The other thing I think that entrepreneurs look to government to do is to help create the basic components of what they need to build a high growth company. And so when I was in Endeavor, we did a lot of research talking scale-up entrepreneurs. And what you heard from them consistently they needed most was access to really fantastic talent, especially technical talent. So the role of countries, if you asked entrepreneurs, would you rather us match investments or create the best tool of talent for you to hire at your companies, that it's going to be based here in the country? And I would argue in the long term, if you look at Argentina's success, much of that is due to the fact that they have a really fantastic pipeline for creating great engineers that's existed for several decades now. I think if you ask entrepreneurs would say what we really want is talent before anything else. And so if you can help us get that by working with universities, please do so.
Would you say talent before stability or stability before talent?
I think they would be tied for first. But this is obviously a time when it's very challenging, when we don't have a lot of stability right now. If you're going to be going through unstable times, I guess you would want to have a really talented team to deal with that. So every entrepreneur's answer might be different, but if I had to pick one, I'd say maybe talent above stability, but they both are very important.
Okay, it's important to say that you guys can send your questions to the chat box below in the application, so we can discuss these issues further later in the session. We'll go to next question, which is about diversity, an issue that Marisol knows very well, but also Mariano and Rhett can elaborate on. Why do you think that there are so few women in entrepreneurial environments and ecosystems still? And I wouldn't say working, because there are a lot of women working in companies, but it's not the same thing when you talk about business leaders. Even in the US, when you see the big leaders of large companies or successful companies, there are very, very few women. Why do you think that is the case, Marisol?
I would perhaps start by the phrase that I used to hear a lot in the US, actually, which was, I can be what I can see, right? And in that sense, I think it's essential for the ecosystem and those that are trying to push it forward to make sure that we showcase the stories of women, of indigenous communities, of people with disabilities who are leading different ideas, different innovations, different processes, because that is the only way that you can reflect yourself on a path like that, right? And I think that historically, what we've seen is men who are creating the big tech companies, men who are generating the new innovations, men who are changing the world through their ideas and the entrepreneurship system, right? And I think that we already know that, right? I think we have shown it, and that's why there have been specific measures taken to attract women and to attract other type of perhaps underrepresented groups to the entrepreneurship ecosystem. But I think it's essential to make sure that we really have a genuine interest to include everyone in these initiatives, and that at the end of the day, as we mentioned before, right, they don't stay in those that have had access to the best education, those who speak English, who have been exposed perhaps to different initiatives around the world, who have traveled, because I think sometimes the tendency ends up being there, right? And I've lived it. I myself see myself as someone who had access to good education, who had networks, who knew how to apply to different programs, and therefore becoming part of the ecosystem perhaps wasn't as hard as for someone who has an amazing idea, but perhaps has been living in a small city in the country with no connections to the ecosystem, right? And I think strong efforts must be made in that sense to make sure that we include these people, that we showcase the experience, and in that sense, I also think the academy world plays an essential role, right? While we are all growing up, I think it's essential for us to see that we can be part of this, right? And I think that in the case of Laboratoria, for example, has been key when we have been trying to include more women in the tech sector, for example. At the beginning, when we used to do our process of admission and call for applicants, we would talk about, come and join the tech sector, right? Be part of this sector that needs more women. We wouldn't get a lot of applications. Like, why should I go there, right? But once we started talking about new job opportunities, that you can be there, and we started showcasing stories and doing a strong storytelling of women who hadn't seen themselves in that space before, and now they are key players perhaps in their company, really makes a click, right, in those other people. So I think that showing these stories, that making real efforts to make sure that we include people that otherwise wouldn't be part of this is essential.
And what do you think about leadership in companies? Why there are so few women leading companies, new companies especially?
Yeah, I think that it starts there, right? I think it's all in the same direction, since we don't see a lot of women in leadership positions. When you are in a working environment, it's hard for you to apply to new jobs, higher responsibilities. And there are studies that show that, for example, when there's a new job application that requires, I don't know, 10 specific characteristics, and women that see the job application have 8 of those, they say, no, I'm not qualified enough. But men perhaps have 3, and they say, I can do this, I can learn it anyways, right? And they apply. And studies show that. And studies show that there's also a bias from the other side, from those that are recruiting for these top positions, that they tend also to hire men for them, because it's an unconscious bias, and it's been proven, right? And there are also studies where you have shown recruiting processes where they cover up the gender of the name of the applicant, and that immediately shows an increase of women being hired. So I think we have insecurities from the side of women because of the techos de cristal that you say here in Chile in Spanish, the crystal ceilings. I don't know if that's the terminology in English, where you don't see women reaching those spots. And at the same time, you have biases from those that are hiring that tend to hire men. So I think we need, on one side, again, public policies that make sure that we start engaging on these issues, but also a strong decision from the private sector to ensure that they have women on their teams. And also from the investor side, you've seen it perhaps little by little, but it's growing, the number of companies that invest on women-led companies, and they have shown really strong returns. There are also studies that show that. So at the end of the day, this is all cultural. It's all part of the society, and it's in our hands to change this and to make sure that we make path for more women. Not because it's cool, not because it's nice, because we need the diversity of thought and experience in those that are leading companies that are creating the solutions of the future.
Okay, Josefina agrees with her head a lot. Huh? What do you think, Mariano? Huh? What's experience in Argentina, and was this an issue that you were working in while you were at the Ministry of Entrepreneurship?
Yes, in fact, we created the Center for the Economic Development of Women in my secretariat with Elena Estrada. She's a very strong leader in the women community, and but from the beginning, we understood that it was like a complex process, and that the explanation of why we have this situation now, it's also complex. So mainly we need to work on the future, and we are working. A couple of things. First, it depends on the sector. I mean, in knowledge economy is big, and in some sectors of knowledge economy, the gap is not so strong. In biotech startups, in design startups, the gap is very different, and in fact, in some cases, there are even more women than men. But especially in the software and the tech sector, the gap is big. And there are many explanations. Some people said it is because of schedules, for example, or that the time of the meetings. Among the other factors that Marisol was mentioning, and I could add to that also investors. There are also studies that there is a bias from investors, maybe an unconscious bias. That's why crowdfunding was so successful with women in the US, for example, because you are analyzing the project there and not you have a personal bias with the entrepreneur. But I would say that to understand that it's a process, it's important because it takes time, and it's happening, and it's and I think also what Marisol mentioning about what you see is very important, and role models. There are not so many, but media could also help with that, and having stories about successful women in this sector can help. I have a personal bias because I have 4 daughters.
Same as me.
Daughters, yes.
I have
really? Well, you understand
0.
me. 7 sisters, 6 sisters, 7 sisters-in-law, and 4 daughters. But no, last night we were watching Enola Holmes with my kids, and there was this issue about women voting. And they couldn't understand that. It was something very strange for them to understand that at a certain time women couldn't vote. So and for them it's so much natural to have more equality between men and women, and in the tech sector, for example. And in that way, I think this pandemic would help a lot. I mean, for at least from my experience. Girls are experienced with technology a lot with this pandemic because of connection with friends, and they are learning tools. My second one, Olivia, she's like the CTO of my home, and she's 8 years old. So I think that maybe one of the positive things of this, and that we are going to see the impact in a couple of years, is a lot of girls being involved with technology because of this. And in the process, I think it would close a lot the gap.
Okay, going to Rhett, I would like to focus on this issue, but on founders. You were talking about the media, and unfortunately, the case I can remember of a founder being a woman is not a good one. It's the Theranos story, which ended badly.
How about we look at we could look at a very recent one. So recently we saw in the news a team. It was a husband and a wife, so it was a man and a woman, co-founded a company. In their country, they were immigrants, part of a religious minority. And the example I'm thinking of is the one in Germany that we saw last week. The company that created the vaccine that Pfizer's using. That seems to have 90% effectiveness in the coronavirus. That's not an all-woman-run company, but the woman is actually the wife in that entrepreneurship pairing. She's actually the one who's the head researcher in a very technical environment. And so I think we do see one that we need as a world. We deeply need to see the best talent working in entrepreneurship. And that talent often comes from places that might be unexpected, from groups that are often underrepresented in entrepreneurship, whether they be women or immigrants or religious minorities or minorities in other senses.
There's a Zoom story, the guy that founded Zoom, which became very successful during the COVID crisis. He's a Chinese immigrant who goes to the US. I think I heard him in San Francisco last year, in the Endeavor conference, and he said that he was rejected, or he was thrown out of the U.S. 4 times, I guess, and the 5th time he was able to come back. And then look at what he has created for the whole world.
Absolutely, and stories like that are very common, because the knowledge and the specific types of intelligence you need to be an entrepreneur and the other types of talent, they are randomly distributed in the population. And if we want to have technologies that help us all live longer, better, healthier lives, then we need to have all of the best players to have access to be on the field. And so I think all the things that are being discussed are really important. My Endeavor's research team in New York released a report recently looking at working with Google, looking at this issue and interviewing, I think, more than 100 or more than 200 high growth founders of tech companies who are women in the United States. And what they found, I think, that we haven't mentioned that's also really important is access to mentors. Certainly all the things that are being mentioned already are important, but in addition to that, access to mentors, because human beings have a very strong tendency to associate with people who are very similar to themselves. Like attracts like, as psychologists often say. And so sometimes it takes some intentional efforts to help build mentoring relationships between individuals who are underrepresented in entrepreneurship, whether they're women or other sorts of underrepresented groups, with those people who have the expertise and the connections that can benefit from them. And so efforts to increase those sorts of policies, I think, are really important. And then just one small thing to add at the end, I think having a continued dialogue, because so many factors are involved with this challenge, is really important. And so finding solutions, I remember interviewing an entrepreneurship organization that found that as soon as they started providing childcare at the events that they hosted in the evening, as soon as they hired teachers to come in and be there for people to bring their kids, the participation in women in terms of women just overnight just increased drastically. And a lot of the men said, this is great for me too. They had more of everyone showing up at the event, but it had an extra benefit or extra boost for helping more women attend. And so sharing these sorts of ideas and learnings, I think, can be really powerful for boosting participation in underrepresented groups.
Okay, so those were the questions we had prepared, and we have some questions from people who are watching us. How many people do we have looking at this panel? Josefina, if you can get that information for us. Very, very interesting conversations. Mariano, this is for you. It's something that always has striken, you say, ha sorprendido mucho, a lot to Chilean entrepreneurs is the success of Argentinian entrepreneurs, especially considering the difficult business environment that has always been around in Argentina for 20 years now. But that was the time when Mercado Libre, for example, started, which is now incredibly the largest company by market cap in Latin America, larger market cap than Vale or Petrobras or Pemex or any commodity company. They should be reaching 60 billion by now, which is pretty impressive, starting from nowhere. Why do you think, and I have a story to tell you afterwards, but why do you think that Argentinian entrepreneurs have done so well in an environment that's so difficult for doing business?
Well, it's a complex answer. Of course, I think of immigration also. Argentina, it's a very diverse country, and that leads to a lot of creativity. So that's an entrepreneurial stories from many decades, which then turned to tech. But at the beginning, it was entrepreneurs in many other sectors. That's one thing. The other is talent, of course, a very important critical mass of engineers and people. But it's not only workforce that you have creative workforce, because usually it's not about having cheap engineers, but you need also to have creative engineers, even if they are not cheap enough. Other factor is venture capital. In the 90s, there was a lot. When Endeavor started in Buenos Aires, at that time, there was availability of venture capital in Buenos Aires and in Argentina. Then, because of many problems, it was like a fade out of venture capital. But availability of that, it was important. Of course, having such a challenging environment, it helps you to be creative also, not immigration, but also the challenging regulations. I always make the same joke, but a tax driver or any people in Argentina is used to hedging, for example, or thinking in 2 or 3 different currencies and how to hedge inflation. That creates people who are very resilient. But
how many dollars do you have now in?
Well, you have like 5 different kinds of dollars, and now you have even at the Netflix dollar, for example. But those are things that, of course, helps, and some public policies, of course. But what we always say is that you cannot just count on that. You need to work in public policy, in consistent public policies, as Rhett was mentioning, because the sort of advantage that Argentina had or used to have, then it was in a sort of slowing down. If you have many years where you have a lot of regulation and it's complicated to startups, then you will have a problem. We always say that it's not enough for somebody to desire to start a business, that they need to see that as possible to decide to start. So you need to work on the environment, on regulation, and not just count on talent. But of course, talent is very, very important, and that's one of the things that any government could do local to work on that at all the different levels. But
would you say that a tougher environment creates stronger entrepreneurs?
I always say that.
We agree.
I don't know if someday we will be, but if you ask the entrepreneurs, they would say that no, they need a more stable environment, because besides the joke that I think in a way the challenging environment can help. But if you ask the entrepreneurs, and I will agree with them, they all want to have a more stable, of course, macroeconomy, but then also regulations to improve the doing business, and to not to be, because the time that the entrepreneurs and startup and scale-ups spend on dealing with bureaucracy and so many things it's exhausting. So they really need to focus on developing their business and not losing time dealing with all the other things, which adds problems to them.
And at your time, I'm sorry that I go back to you, but in your time as minister, if you could identify that one was the toughest problem or the most important problem, why couldn't you do more to solve it? And I'm sure there are many restrictions and political issues, but
well, when I was at the office, we identified many things to change. Competitiveness, taxes. So we approved a law for SMEs to reduce taxes. So we reduce, and it's almost more than 1 million SMEs that are registered now in that law that we created to reduce taxes. Then we approved another law, which was the entrepreneurial law, inspired in the simplified companies from Chile and from Colombia. And we created a new kind of corporation, which is the SAS, that helped the entrepreneurs to start a business. In a digital way, with books on blockchain, it was 15 minutes to start a company with 10% of the cost. So it was a big hit. That also, we identified that there was a problem in bureaucracy. So we created the simplification area, and we reduced a lot of proceedings, and everything was online and digital, and we saved billions of pesos to the startups in dealing with bureaucracy and with the government. Also, we established the matching funds program. We did many things, with the budget that we have and the time that we have. We couldn't resolve everything. As I mentioned, it's a process, but at least in the areas that we identified that were important, we started. The problem then is consistency. Okay, now some of those policies are being challenged now. The SAS, for example, and then we establish an export proceeding for a simplified export proceeding for startups. It's challenged again. So that's the problem. We couldn't solve everything, and in some cases we are going backwards with some of the policies, unfortunately.
Okay, Rhett, this is for you. I think you studied the Chilean ecosystem some years ago, and thinking about some of the questions that we made to Mariano, Chileans tend to stay in Chile doing business more than Argentinians. That some of the explanation can be that because the local environment is tougher, they go and look for at least for the Latin American market as their goal, instead of looking at just the local market, which was very, very cozy and business friendly in Chile, and that could be a reason why companies didn't scale up as they should. Now things are changing here, and there are more incertidumbre. I don't know how to say that in English. Uncertainty in the horizon. Do you think that could be, in a sense, a good thing for entrepreneurship in terms of people thinking about doing business not just in Chile but abroad and developing larger companies?
I think so. I think that uncertainty helps people who are considering being entrepreneurs to see more value in being an entrepreneur. So if you are worried about the company that you're working for because it's out of your control, you might say, well, I think I can do at least as good at building something myself. And then I have more control. I can be more adaptive. So I think that we are, there have been studies to show that many of the most innovative and successful companies over the last several decades have been started during recessions because talented people left companies that aren't doing very well. They were able to get other people to work with them, usually at a very cheap rate because of the recession. And coming out of the recession, because things were unstable, that created more opportunities for new people to come in. So I do think that there's a good chance that we'll see some really great companies emerging out of this uncertainty. In terms of kind of focusing on larger companies that can scale up more in Chile, I think that there's much more. If I look back to where things were 10 years ago, the first time that I visited Chile and talked to people about entrepreneurship to where things are now, there is much more of a recognition that entrepreneurship is important with the development programs through Corfo and Startup Chile, but also that there's more and more focus on scaling up, that really growing is how value is being added. And so I think that the fact that you're seeing those messages resonate more and more, and we're seeing more and more examples across all of Latin America of companies really scaling up and becoming unicorns or being acquired and being very successful, and entrepreneurs able to work across international boundaries, I think is ultimately really good for Chile too. That there've been some really big successes in the tech sector in Chile, and I think there's a lot more to come.
Great. And talking about that, Marisol, one question for you, a very difficult one, but important one as well. So prepare for it. I'm going to read it. Chile is passing through an interesting moment in which we will discuss a new constitution. What do you think entrepreneurs like you can offer? And what would you like to see in our country in the next year regarding the entrepreneurial ecosystem? The microphones are open.
Let's see. All the pressure upon the question.
You were not prepared for that. But rephrasing it, how do you think the entrepreneurial issue should be present in the discussion of a new constitution?
No, definitely. I think that innovation and entrepreneurship should be considered in this new constitution regarding access and opportunities that this brings to people, right? And how we ensure that those that want to push forward new businesses can have all the tools necessary in order to move forward. And again, with a perspective that includes everyone, not only women, not only people with the best access to education, not only those that have been already successful, perhaps with doing businesses or generating an entrepreneurship business before, but with a view that integrates and give access to everyone. And I think we have a historic opportunity here, right? With the opportunity of having an equal group of people, men and women, narrating this constitution that can ensure that we have all the rights for women also being considered in this, and that includes the rights to develop your business and your entrepreneurship in the way that perhaps you want to, with the tools that are necessary, right? So I think the capacity to think differently, the capacity to have new visions, new ideas, all of that are in people that have lived different experiences, and that it's in our hands and it's our duty to be able that we give all those people that have had different experiences to be able to grow from that and add value, not only to themselves, but to the economy and to the country.
Great. I would add to that one thing that Rhett mentioned that came out of the study of the scale-up and ecosystem, that basically said that 1% of the new, actually it's less than that, 0.89% of the companies that are the scale-ups create 40% of the new jobs in Chile in the last, I would say, 3 years, which is super impressive. So they are job creators, and entrepreneurs need stability and clear rules, and not even help from the government, but stable rules in order to do our job. That's my personal view. When you link the growth of companies with the jobs created, that's how you make a country progress and a better place for everybody. Would you guys like to say some closing remarks about this talk and some afterthoughts before we go to the next panel, where we have Alejandra Llosa, founder of KO, a chain of wellness centers from Peru? Marisol.
I would just say that that for these ecosystems to grow, I think that we need everyone to feel that we are part of it. And as entrepreneurs, for example, to make sure that all of you who are perhaps listening feel that you have the right and perhaps even the obligation to talk to the public sector, to talk to the academy, to talk to the private companies and to investors on what you think the gaps are and how we could push this system forward, because it's also in our hands, right? As you have mentioned, we can depend on all the others to do the work. I think it's also in our hands to make sure that we help push this forward. I would also say that to perhaps people that are listening that have ideas, that are starting new businesses, that this is a fascinating world. It's a fascinating ecosystem. Now that also we are talking a lot in Chile about the tone, and we've also seen it in the US, right? That the tone that our leaders perhaps are using today is far from being collaborative. And I think the entrepreneurship ecosystem from its nature is collaborative. Mm-hmm. And I think I've lived that firsthand. We are all there, always happy to help others that are starting, or happy to share learnings, happy to help others that are in this path. And I think that it's in our hands to maintain that and to perhaps try to share it to other parts of the economy, because I think that today also more than ever collaboration is essential. And I also would say to those that are listening to go for it, to keep fighting for your projects, for your ideas. It's an amazing roller coaster filled with challenges, but also filled with immense satisfaction. And specifically those that are like us that are in the social impact entrepreneurship area, I think we have an important opportunity to make things happen and to make this a better world. And having amazing people like the ones in these panels shows us that there are people thinking and pushing forward the ecosystem that can allow us to do our work.
Great closing remarks, Marisol. Congratulations for that. Mariano.
Yes, well, and now I'm back in the private sector. After almost 7 years, I have a consultancy firm called Marea Venture Partners, but we are still working in the development of ecosystems, as Marisol mentioned it, which is, I think, is very important. We are mainly focused on a concept that I liked a lot, which is value chains. It seems an old concept, but I think it's very, very important now, especially because of this collaboration view that Marisol was mentioning, or openness, or a vision of shared created value. Digital transformation is being accelerated, and especially corporations are starting to understand that they are part of the ecosystem and that they can create value chains and not chains, just chains, okay? And in that sense, I think that they are starting to learn this vision from the entrepreneurial ecosystem about working together, about partnerships, about solving problems between companies, big to big, or startup with big companies. That is very interesting, especially with the challenges that we have in our region, which is mainly the digital transformation for good of the traditional sectors. And there's a big opportunity there for startups if they can talk and have good relations with the rest of the members of the value chains, especially with big corporations. So I think that that would be, that is going to be a very interesting phenomenon in our region in the following years.
Great, thank you, Mariano. Rhett, from New York City, no?
That's right. So I would just say the thing that stands out to me most right now for entrepreneurs is while we do have a challenging year in 2020 with a lot of change, I think there are tremendous opportunities that are going to be identified by entrepreneurs in the coming years coming out of this crisis. And that there is a cause and reason for some optimism. And so I'd say just ending with that and saying thank you all very much for having me. Great to be with all three of you in this very important and interesting discussion within kind of the Endeavor Network today. So thanks.
Great, thank you very much, Rhett. And thank you all because we had a great conversation, and this is probably one of the most important subjects for the development of our countries. So thank you everybody who listened to us and on our panel. So having said that, we are looking at the presentation of KO. Alejandra Llosa, founder of a chain of wellness centers, is gonna tell us her story and her thoughts. Thank you very much to everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Take care.
Bye.
Ciao.
Ciao.